In the desolate ash field of Montana, a 7-year-old girl knelt before a bleeding wild horse. She placed her hand on its forehead and whispered, "I lost my mom, too. Don't give up." From a distance, a shattered ex-firefighter stood frozen. In the blurred light of a scorched night, life quietly began again. Subscribe now, and don't miss the moving and healing stories we bring to you. The screen is black. Silence. Then, a low, distant rumble. Not thunder. Something else. The whisper of wind through ash. The low creak of burned branches bending under their own charred weight. Montana. Wide. Broken. Still smoldering. A slow flycam shot drifts over the ghost of what was once a forest. Charcoal black trunks rise like bones from the earth. No green, no bird song. Just the sound of the wind licking through the carcass of trees. Then a small figure moving like a ghost through the haze. Bare feet. A stick-thin body. Long hair tangled behind her like a net. She walks alone, carrying a bundle of old damp wood in her arms. Wood that used to be a fence post, a chair someone's house maybe. Now it's her fuel. Ellie, 7. Every few steps she pauses to cough. The air is thick. Gray. Every breath is a small rebellion. Her sweater is 3 sizes too big, sleeves dragging. The hem of her skirt is burned at the edges. She doesn't notice anymore. She adjusts the bundle in her arms, her thin fingers trembling slightly from the cold and the weight. One hand brushes across a piece of wood, splintered, half-burned, still smelling faintly of fire. Her fingers linger on the edge of it. Her eyes follow. We see what she sees. An imprint scorched into the plank, the vague shape of a teddy bear's eye. Melted plastic. A memory of something once loved. Ellie stares at it for a beat too long, then turns away and continues walking. Behind her, smoke curls upward like ghosts that refuse to rise. She follows a barely visible path, one she must have memorized. Past collapsed sheds, rusted tools poking from the dirt like bones. She walks like someone who has walked this route too many times. Then hoofbeats, soft, muffled, uneven. She freezes. Wind brushes her hair into her face. She squints. Through the shimmer of heat and smoke, a shape shifts. White, lopsided. Not mist, not hallucination. It's a horse, a real horse. But it's wrong. Something's wrong. She steps forward carefully, slowly. Her breath caught in her throat. The horse is standing halfway collapsed against a bent wire fence, one back leg tangled in rusted barbed wire. Its coat is matted with ash patches of dried blood on the flank. White but dulled like a statue forgotten in a storm. One of its eyes is closed. The other blinks slowly. It doesn't move as she approaches. Ellie sets down her bundle of wood without a sound. For a moment, she just watches it. Her chest rises and falls with the rhythm of quiet awe and fear. Her hand drifts forward. Then she drops to her knees. Her small fingers move quickly, expertly, working at the barbed wire. One strand is embedded in the horse's leg. The skin around it is swollen, raw. She winces. "I'm sorry," she whispers. The horse jerks slightly. She pauses. Her voice lowers again, barely audible. "You're not going to die here, okay?" She takes off her sweater, wrapping the sleeve around her palm. Then she pulls sharp and fast. The barbed wire gives way with a snap. The horse lets out a low sound. Not a scream, not a neigh. Something else. Like breath, exhaling pain. Ellie drops, the wire crawls closer and rests her forehead softly against the horse's neck. The animal flinches. "It's okay," she whispers. "You're not alone." She reaches up, brushing a streak of blood from its cheekbone with the back of her hand. "You lost someone too, huh?" The horse shifts but doesn't pull away. She looks into its eye. It's dark and glazed, but slowly it begins to sharpen. "Me too," she says. "I lost my mama in the fire. I think I still hear her sometimes. But I know it's just in my head. A beat, but I talk to her anyway." The horse lowers its head slightly. Its nose brushes her shoulder. The gesture is so soft it nearly breaks the silence in two. "I'm Ellie," she adds and places a hand gently over its heartbeat. "You're shaking. That's okay. I do too, mostly at night." She sits back on her heels, taking in the animal's frame. Ribs visible, muscles twitching, legs trembling. "You're not ugly," she whispers. "Even if they told you that. You're not broken. You're just hurt." She closes her eyes for a second. Her face contorts as if holding something in. "I'm gonna name you Ashes," she says finally. The horse lifts its head. Wind rustles the dry grass around them. The sky shifts gray-blue. Cut to Noah, 40, standing several yards away behind a charred wooden beam, watching. His boots are planted in ash. His flannel shirt is streaked with soot, his jeans torn at the knee. His beard is thick, his eyes red. His hand is gripping a rusted lighter. Not lighting it, just holding it. The camera pulls in slowly on his face. His eyes never leave Ellie. He doesn't move, doesn't blink. He watches the small girl press her cheek to the wounded animal, like someone who believes that her warmth alone can heal it. And something in him shifts. His fingers loosen. The lighter drops into the dirt. Clink! Noah flinches. The sound seems louder than it is. Ellie hears it too. Her head snaps up. For a split second, their eyes meet. Hers wide, curious, unafraid. His startled, like a deer caught in guilt. Shame flickers across his face. He steps back. Ellie doesn't chase. She just holds Ashes a little tighter. Then, the screen goes black again. A title appears in small white letters. Ashes in Montana. Underneath, there are things the fire couldn't burn. Cut to Ashes lowering its head, nuzzling into Ellie's arm, as a thin cloud of ash blows across the field like a curtain falling. The steel door creaks open. Noah steps into the rusting shipping container he calls home. It's wedged behind an abandoned gas station, framed by crumpled fences and an overgrown thistle field. No lights, no windows. Just shadows and stale air thick with metal and memory. He doesn't bother to turn on the lamp. He knows the path to his cot by feel 6 steps forward, pivot left, 1 step more. His boots hit the dirt-streaked rug. He sits on the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, hands trembling. The wind rattles the corrugated steel walls like something whispering through its teeth. He unzips his coat, pulls out a crushed pack of cigarettes. Empty. He sighs. His eyes catch the battered Zippo lighter sitting on the edge of a milk crate beside the bed. The initials HC are faintly engraved on the side. He picks it up, flips the top open with one hand. Click, a small flame dances into life. And just like that, he's no longer in the container. He's back in it. Flashback. Smoke everywhere. The world is on fire. Screams, cracking beams. The orange roar of a barn engulfed in flames. Noah is younger, cleaner shaven face streaked with soot. He's yelling something to someone, eyes wide, body lurching through fire. Inside the inferno, 3 men, his teammates, trapped beneath a collapsed rafter, coughing, pinned. The roof above them groans. A wall is about to go. Noah moves, someone shouts behind him. But he doesn't. He's trying to reach the others. He's 6 feet away, 5'4". Suddenly, a high-pitched scream, not human. Then, through the smoke, a blur of white surges in. A horse, mane tangled, eyes wild, flames licking at its flanks. The men scream louder. The horse doesn't flinch. It leaps over fallen timber, kicks the beam aside, allows 2 men to crawl free. The third lies motionless. Noah runs to him, pulling the man up just as the roof collapses. Everything goes white. Back in the container, Noah jolts up, breathing like he's been punched in the chest. The flame is still alive in the lighter. He snaps it shut, tosses it across the room. It hits the wall, clatters, then silence. He presses the heel of his hand to his temple. He doesn't cry. He never cries. But his eyes glisten. Outside, wind howls through the cracks in the gas station's broken signage. A lone tumbleweed rolls across the gravel. He lays back, staring at the metal ceiling. The horse was real. He remembers it. But no one ever believed him. They called it a hallucination, a product of trauma. He believed them. Until today. Cut to a wooden cabin deep in the scrubland, Ellie's home. The inside is humble walls darkened by years of smoke, a single shelf of canned beans and powdered milk. A kettle rattles over a tiny propane burner. Her grandmother Mabel sits beside it. Her posture is rigid, but her hands shake. She's stirring a thin pot of oatmeal with a spoon that clinks against the sides. She wears a faded patch over her left eye. Her hair is braided into a long gray tail that hangs over one shoulder. Her right hand has a tremor. Her voice is soft, like cloth pulled through ash. "Bring me the red book, Ellie." Ellie walks across the room and reaches under a blanket. She pulls out a charred children's reader, its corners blackened pages curled by fire. She sets it on the table. The cover reads, "Adventures with Air." The letters half melted. Mabel nods. "Let's do page 17 today." Ellie sits across from her, climbing onto a stack of old milk crates to reach the table. She opens the book slowly, gently, as if each turn of a page risks collapse. The wind is fast. She reads, her voice fragile but deliberate. "It moves the leaves. The clouds like it too." Mabel smiles, tired but proud. "You've got your mama's voice, baby." "But your own fire." Ellie blushes. Then her face darkens. "They're coming, Grandma." Mabel stops stirring. "Who?" "The land people. They left a letter. Said, we don't have ownership credentials. Said we have to move." Mabel is quiet. The spoon falls from her hand into the pot. She leans back in her chair, breath slowing. "They always come," she says. "But where will we go?" "Nowhere. We stand. But sometimes the world wants to blow you off the map, child. You anchor yourself with truth and stay." Ellie fidgets with the edge of her sleeve. Her eyes flick to the corner of the room where a picture frame sits, glass-cracked photo of her mother inside. "I met a horse," she says. Mabel looks up. "A real one." Ellie nods. "He's white. But not clean white. Like smoke white. Like he used to be snow, but something burned him." Mabel exhales through her nose. "You fed him." "No, he was hurt." "You touched him." Ellie hesitates, then nods. Mabel just smiles faintly, like that answer was all she needed. Later, sunset. Ellie steps outside, wrapping her coat tight. The wind pulls at her bangs. She walks across the yard, past the melted tire swing, past the tin cans stacked as wind chimes toward the horizon, where the land curves like a bruise. She puts 2 fingers in her mouth and lets out a whistle, sharp, clean, almost bird-like. Nothing. She whistles again. For a long second, just silence. Then, a distant snort. She squints. Far out near the remains of a barbed fence, Ashes appears. Still limping, still wounded, but standing. Ellie doesn't wave, doesn't call. She just stands there. Ashes watches her. Their eyes lock across a football field of dying grass. The horse takes 1 step forward. So does Ellie, but neither runs. Not yet. The wind moves between them like a messenger. The color of the sky shifts lavender to bruised pink. A day ending. A bond beginning. Somewhere behind her, Mabel plays an old cassette music, warbled distant, gentle. A woman's voice singing. "Though the fire took our home, it couldn't take our hands. We still hold the sky tonight in ash and promised land." The camera pulls up, rising above Ellie, above Ashes, above the torn earth they stand on. 2 souls, 2 survivors. The world is still burning. But now, they are not alone in it. The night is cold enough to crack silence. Noah leans against a blackened pine tree at the edge of the forest. Arms, folded eyes scanning the clearing where Ash still sleeps in the dirt. The sky above is ink-blue stars pinned like silent watchers. In the distance, footsteps. Ellie appears, shoulders hunched against the wind hands, tucked into oversized sleeves. Her steps are slow, but sure, like she knows where she belongs, even if the world disagrees. She says nothing when she reaches him. He doesn't look at her. She crouches, gathers a few brittle twigs, arranges them methodically over the ghost of a fire pit that's been used many times but never truly warmed anyone. She strikes a match. Nothing. Another. This one takes. A flicker. A promise. They both watch it grow the way you'd watch an injured animal trying to stand. Crackling fills the silence. Still no words. The flames reach up like they're cold too. Noah glances at her from the corner of his eye. She's staring into the fire like it holds something she lost. Her face illuminated, orange-red lashes catching the light. There's ash on her cheek. Maybe a tear, hard to tell. He lowers himself beside her. The dirt is cold. His knees creak. More silence. But it isn't empty. It's the kind that's earned. Her voice comes small, like a thread unspooling in wind. "I used to be scared of fire." He waits. She continues. "Now, I think it's just a thing that forgot how to love." Noah's breath hitches. a strange sound for a man who hasn't spoken in hours. "You think things remember?" she asks him. His voice is rough but steady. "Some things do." They watch the fire breathe. Then, without a word, Ellie shifts, leans gently, and rests her head against his shoulder. Noah stiffens. Every muscle flinches like a soldier under attack. But then, he exhales, long, slow, and he lets her stay. His body relaxes, not all the way, but enough. She doesn't move, doesn't press. She just exists there beside him, head on his shoulder. And for the first time in 6 years, he doesn't shake under someone's touch. The next day, the town of Redbridge is small, just a few weather-beaten buildings along a cracked 2-lane road. A faded gas station, a diner, a feed store with more dust than seed. Inside the medical outpost, light flickers overhead. The walls are lined with old anatomy posters and mismatched cabinets. Ruth stands at the sink washing her hands. Her hair is pulled back into a messy knot, stethoscope swinging from her neck. Her face is soft but sharp, the kind that's learned to carry truth without apology. The front door jingles. She looks up, then freezes. Ellie steps in first, unsure. Then Noah behind her eyes, darting like he regrets every inch walked. Ruth dries her hands slowly, steps out from behind the counter. "Well, damn," she says, voice low and warm. "Ghosts walking in my clinic." Noah doesn't smile. Ruth moves forward anyway, arms out, but stops short, sensing the boundary in his breath. "Still allergic to hugs," she says gently. He gives her a nod. That's all. She turns to Ellie, crouches. "You must be the girl with the eyes like flint." Ellie blinks. "Like what?" "Like you could strike 'em against stone and light a fire." Ellie shrugs, unsure if it's a compliment. "She's got an animal out back," Noah says, finally speaking. "Need someone to take a look." "What kind of animal?" "Horse." Ruth freezes. She walks to the window, peers out past the torn blinds. Ashes stands there, head low, mane tangled, one hind leg still favoring the ground. His coat is a storm cloud white, ghosted by soot and memory. Ruth's breath catches. "I've seen that horse before," she whispers. Noah shifts. "You sure?" She turns. 6 years ago, the Larkspur fire, you remember? His jaw tightens. "Don't bring that up. I wasn't in the blaze. I was triage." But they brought back a story about a horse that ran straight into the fire, kicked down a beam, saved 3 men. One of them disappeared after. Her eyes land on Noah. "I thought it was bullshit." Noah doesn't answer. His silence confirms everything. Ruth walks past them out the door into the cold. She approaches Ashes slowly, palms up. The horse flinches, but doesn't back away. Ellie stands nearby, watching every movement. Ruth crouches beside the injured leg, gentle as wind. Wire burn. Deep but healing. This scar, though. She brushes a fingertip along a thick raised burn across Ash's flank. "I've seen this before. This is fire damage." Ellie steps forward. He was left behind. Ruth looks at her. "By who?" "I don't know. But he didn't stop saving people, even after." Ruth stands. The wind tosses her hair into her face. She pushes it back, stares at the horse. "He shouldn't be alive." "Neither should I." Noah says, eyes locked on Ashes. Ruth turns slowly. Her voice is quieter now. "You really saw him that night?" Noah nods once. "I tried to tell them. They said I cracked. That I imagined it. That no horse would charge into fire. Said I made it up to deal with." He trails off. Doesn't finish the sentence. Ruth steps closer. "Well, he's here now." They all stand in silence. Ellie strokes Ash's muzzle. The wind shifts. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cries. Ruth turns back to Ellie. "Do you want to know the story?" she asks. Ellie nods. Inside the clinic, Ellie sits cross-legged on a bench, cradling a chipped mug of cocoa. Ashes is tied outside, grazing what little green he can find. Noah leans against the wall, arms crossed, shadows hiding his face. Ruth begins. 6 years ago, Larkspur Canyon caught fire from both ends. Fast. Dry season. No time to react. One barn caught with 6 men inside. One was Noah. Ellie looks up. No one knew how the door got kicked down. They found hoof marks in the ash. Thought it was a mule. But one man swore it was a white horse. Said it looked him straight in the eye before disappearing. She looks at Noah. He stays silent. They found tufts of white hair. Burned. Traces of blood. But no horse. Ruth's voice lowers. They said it wasn't possible. That animals don't run into fire, they run away. But Ashes didn't, Ellie says. No, Ruth agrees. Ashes ran toward it. A long pause. Then Ellie whispers, maybe he was looking for someone. Ruth raises an eyebrow. Who? Ellie shrugs. Someone like me, who lost something in the flames. Noah swallows hard, looks out the window. Ashes lifts his head. Their eyes meet through glass. And something ancient, something not quite nameable, passes between them. Outside later, Ellie stands beside Ashes. She runs her hand along his neck, then turns to Noah. Why'd you bring me here? He doesn't answer. Ruth steps out, arms folded, watching them both. Because she says for him he didn't know what else to do. Because he's been living with a ghost for 6 years. And today, he found out the ghost has a name and a heartbeat. Ellie doesn't look away. Do we get to keep him? She asks. Ruth sighs. He's not chipped. No tags. If no one claims him legally, he's just an animal. But he's more than that. Ruth smiles. I know. Ellie leans into Ashes. He doesn't flinch. Her cheek presses to his shoulder. She whispers something we don't hear. Noah watches, jaw clenched. Something breaking. Something mending. Ruth places a hand on his shoulder. You've got a choice, she says. I didn't choose anything, he mutters. You're choosing now. Noah looks away. Let her heal you, Ruth says, or stay broken. His eyes fall on Ellie, and for the first time he nods. Not to Ruth, not even to himself. To the girl, to the horse, to the fire that didn't kill him, but left him hollow. He's choosing to fill the hollow. The morning came too soon. The wind was sharp that day, not cruel, not loud, just intentional, like it knew something was about to be taken. Outside the cabin, the air carried the scent of cold iron and bureaucracy. Ellie sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, tracing her finger along a faded crack between the planks. On the table beside her, a chipped tin box, her mother's ashes. The lid always sealed, never opened. Inside the kettle oats, boiled watery and thin, barely breakfast. Mabel stirred them without looking. Her one good eye stared at the door. She had already heard the tires, the gravel crunch, the radio's murmuring. Ellie looked up at her. They're here, she said quietly. Mabel nodded, as if that word didn't belong to this world anymore. A loud knock. Ellie flinched. The kind of knock that doesn't ask to come in, it announces. Mabel stood. Her bones protested. She didn't argue. She moved slowly toward the door, every step like a chapter closing. She opened it. 2 men in uniform, clean-shaven, not cruel, just official. One held a clipboard, the other kept a respectful distance. Ms. Mabel Whitley. Mabel nodded once. We're here under directive from the State Land Reclamation Office. This property has been verified as illegally occupied. Mabel's voice was quiet, steady. My husband built this house before your daddy was born. I understand, ma'am. But records show no title, no deed, and the land is earmarked for wildfire buffer expansion. I buried my daughter out back. We're sorry, but this isn't optional. Ellie stepped forward, her fists clenched. You can't take us. The man with the clipboard softened his voice. We're not taking you, sweetheart. We're just asking you to gather your belongings. Mabel walked slowly to the corner of the room, picked up a small wooden box, smooth from years of holding. She opened it. Inside, her daughter's urn, the ceramic warm from the sunbeam through the window. She clutched it close. Then her knee buckled. She stumbled. Ellie rushed forward. The box slipped from Mabel's grip. Crash. The lid popped. Ash scattered across the floor like a dust storm without wind. Mom? Ellie dropped to her knees. Her hands hovered over the spilled remains. Not touching, just witnessing. The room fell into silence thick enough to choke on. The officer stepped back, hat in his hands. The clipboard forgotten. Outside, the wind shifted. And then, a sound. Hooves. Ashes emerged from the tree line like a sentinel carved in motion. Not running, not charging, just walking. Deliberate, slow. The officers turned toward the noise. One reached instinctively for his radio, but stopped. Ashes stepped onto the porch, past the old tire swing, through the broken gate. His body moved like he remembered this place, like he knew what it stood for. He reached the doorstep and stood between the officers and Ellie. He didn't snort, didn't paw the ground. He simply existed, large, scarred, undeniable. His presence was like a pause button pressed on reality. One officer stepped forward. Ashes didn't flinch. The officer took another step. Ashes lowered his head. Not aggressive, just resolute. A line had been drawn. "Back up," the other one muttered. "Don't spook it." "I'm not." I said back up. They did. Ellie looked up through the legs of the horse, through the mane that fell like smoke. Her eyes met the officer's, and for the first time they blinked first. Mabel slowly reached down, gathering the ashes into the urn with her trembling hands. "Help me up," she whispered. Ellie helped her stand. They turned. They saw him. Noah, standing in the dust, at the edge of the clearing. No hat, no coat, just a man carrying a silence that weighed more than the law. He didn't speak to the officers. He just walked forward past them toward the doorway, where Ellie stood holding her grandmother's hand. She looked up at him. He looked at her. The old world, the one that promised nothing and kept even less, tried to hold on to her for one more breath. But Noah extended his hand, not like a rescuer, not like a savior, just a man who had once been saved. "I don't have much," he said, his voice low, raw. "No house, no promises. I can't say it'll be better." Ellie didn't blink. "But I won't leave you," he finished. "Not ever." She looked at his hand, then at Mabel, then at Ashes. She reached out slowly and placed her small hand into his calloused one. The officers said nothing. Ashes stepped aside. Noah, Ellie, and Mabel walked past the uniformed men, past the place where law had no room for memory. Ashes followed. As they reached the old fence line, Ellie turned around. The cabin stood still. The ashes they hadn't gathered yet swirled gently near the steps, caught in a breeze, like a memory being carried forward. She whispered something to herself, then turned back. Noah tightened his grip just enough to be felt, and they walked on. The truck coughed, wheezed, then rumbled alive, like a beast waking from sleep. Noah was at the wheel. Ellie sat between him and Mabel, wrapped in a quilt with frayed edges, holding a thermos of lukewarm broth. Ashes followed behind, tethered to the trailer with a rope knotted loosely around the hitch. No saddle, no reins. Just trust. The Montana roads glistened under slush and ice snow melting into secrets. Fields passed like faded photographs. Ghost barns, silos like watchtowers. Burn scars still visible across ridges where the fire had left its signature. Ellie leaned her head against the window. Raindrops traced slow, winding stories down the glass. Mabel slept. Her hand, thin as a bird's foot, rested gently over Ellie's knee. It rose and fell with each breath. Noah didn't speak, but the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It had begun to hold shape. They passed the husk of a mining town. Cabins sagging inward, signs half-eaten by rust. The truck stopped beside a collapsed tool shed, not far from the shell of a hunting lodge. "Here," Noah muttered. He stepped out, boots crunching gravel. Ellie helped her grandmother down. The cold bit harder now. There was no electricity, no heat, just wood walls, a rusted stove, and a stack of blankets Noah had stashed years ago when he still believed in escape plans. Ashes stepped forward, hooves slick but sure eyes alert. They stayed there that night. Noah built a fire. Ellie fed Ashes an apple so soft it collapsed in her palm. Mabel recited Psalm 46 under her breath, voice cracking halfway through. The world was shrinking to 4 hearts, but far away, Ruth was waking something bigger. Redbridge Library, microfiche archive room. Ruth sat in a coat too thin for January. Her fingers danced over faded newspaper reels, eyes scanning headlines from 6 years back. Larkspur Fire 3. Dead 2. Missing. Miracle rescue still under investigation. Anonymous witness claims ghost horse saved crew. She paused, rewinded. One frame, a blurry photo, a tail caught mid-motion in the smoke, a horse's outline, almost too faint to see. But Ruth saw it. She clicked deeper. City files, emergency response rosters, equipment manifests. Then she found it. Montana Fire Division, Equine Rescue Division archived. List of horses, assignments, decommissioning dates. One name jumped out. Unit 7 Ashes, retired status unavailable. No reason, no injury record, just vanished. Ruth stared at the word unavailable like it had lied to her. She made the call. Phone rang 4 times. Then, Office of Mayor Isaac Teller. "This is Ruth Connors, Redbridge Health Services. I need to speak to Mayor Teller about a horse." Silence. Then, "Excuse me, Unit 7. Ashes. I have a documentation showing he was never properly decommissioned. More silence. I'll connect you. Click. Mayor's office. Downtown Missoula. Isaac Teller's hair had gone white, but he still wore his fire badge on the wall. A legacy man. Hero turned politician. Hands folded, eyes alert. Ruth stood across from him, arms crossed. "You're not here for a vaccination form, are you?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm here for the truth." He leaned back. "Unit 7 was injured in Larkspur," he began. "We had budget cuts. Vet said he wouldn't run again. Protocol says we humanely release or rehome, but things got messy." "What does messy mean, Isaac?" He exhaled through his nose. "There was a call to euthanize. I objected. Some paperwork disappeared. Next thing I know, the corral's empty. Nobody claimed responsibility. You didn't file a report." He looked out the window. "Because I thought the horse was dead." He wasn't. She laid a photo on his desk taken 2 days ago. Ellie Ashes, the scar clearly visible. His face changed. It was subtle, but it changed. "That horse saved lives," she said. And then was discarded like he didn't matter. He didn't respond. "You want to make it right, Isaac?" He looked at her. "You're assuming I still can. You're the mayor. That's all you do." Back at the cabin, Ellie sat with Ashes huddled beneath an overhang, the fire, inside just embers now. It was raining lightly. Not enough to drench, but enough to blur edges. She ran her hand down Ash's side, then reached his leg, the scarred one. He shifted, but didn't pull away. Her fingers brushed the raised tissue along the joint. It was jagged, not a clean break, but a ripped story that had healed sideways. "You didn't deserve that," she whispered. Ashes turned his head slightly. She touched the groove near his hoof, deep, angry, pinked with memory. And then he made a sound, low, soft, from the chest, a whimper almost human. Ellie's lip quivered. "I'm sorry," she said. The sound he made wasn't loud, but it was the first thing he'd said. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his leg. "I know how it feels to be forgotten." Tears slid down her cheek and landed on the old earth beneath him. Ashes didn't move. He just let her be broken beside him, let her grief join his. Inside, Noah stood at the window, watching them. His jaw clenched. His hand gripped the back of a chair until the wood creaked. Mabel sat by the fire, eyes closed. "He's changing," she said softly. Noah didn't turn. "Who?" "The horse." Noah shook his head. "No, it's her." Mabel opened one eye. "No," she said. "It's both." That night a storm rolled in, but no one ran. They were no longer the kind of people who did. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than rain. Inside the cabin, Ellie sat hunched over a scrap of paper torn from an old receipt book, a pencil stub in her hand. Her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth as she wrote slow, deliberate strokes, pausing after each word, like she was trying to hear whether it felt true. Mabel dozed in the chair beside her, the fire crackling softly behind them. Ashes stood just outside the open door, eyes half-lidded, the mist of his breath rising like quiet prayers. Ellie wrote, "Dear Governor, my name is Ellie Whitley. I'm 7 and I live with my grandma and a horse named Ashes. He saved people once, but no one saved him back. That's not right. He's not just a horse. He's someone. He remembers. Please help us. Sincerely, Ellie and Ashes." She folded the paper slowly, careful not to smudge the pencil. Then she slid it into an old envelope with someone else's name scratched off. She licked the flap, pressed it shut. Noah stood in the doorway watching. "Where'd you learn to write like that?" he asked, voice rough. Ellie didn't look up. "Grandma. She says words are like horses. They can run towards someone or run away." He blinked. She held up the letter. "Do you think someone will read it?" Noah didn't answer, because hope was something he hadn't held in years. And he wasn't sure how to tell a child that the world rarely listened, especially when it should. Later that day, he walked deep into the woods alone. The ground was wet, soft beneath his boots. Pines stood like sentinels, watching unmoving, ancient. The kind of trees that remembered every flame and every lie. Noah kept walking until the air grew colder. Then he stopped. His knees gave out without warning. He sank to the damp forest floor, hands gripping the moss and dirt like they were the only things keeping him from falling through the earth. For a long time he said nothing. Then I ran. The words were barely more than breath. I ran while they burned. I saw them reaching for me. I heard them scream. And his voice cracked. I ran the other way. His shoulders shook. Tears came suddenly without drama, clean, raw collapses of a man who'd held his guilt like a bone in his throat. I was supposed to bring them home. I was their damn captain. A voice came behind him. I know. He turned. Ruth stood 10 feet away, raincoat open, eyes fierce. I know, she said again, and I don't care. He stared at her, confused, defensive. You think I haven't seen ghosts? She said. You think you're the only one who's carried someone you left behind? I didn't leave them behind, he snapped. You survived, she cut in. And you've been punishing yourself for it every day since. That's not atonement, Noah. That's self-destruction dressed in guilt. He turned his face away. Ruth stepped forward. You didn't die in that fire, she said. But you sure as hell haven't lived since. He looked up at her, eyes rimmed red. Then what am I supposed to do? She didn't answer right away. She let the silence land between them. Then softly, live for her. Noah's brow furrowed. And for that horse, Ruth continued. For both of them. Because they still have something you gave up on, a soul that hasn't given up. He shook his head. I don't know how. Ruth knelt beside him, her voice breaking. Start by forgiving the man who came out of that fire. That night back at the cabin, Ellie stood beside Ashes, brushing his coat with an old kitchen rag. She hummed softly the same tune Mabel used to sing while cooking stew. Her hands moved in small, practiced circles. She paused at the scar on his hind leg. Her fingers traced it slowly. You're still beautiful, she whispered. Ashes tilted his head slightly. The wind caught his mane and pushed it into her cheek. She giggled, just once. Noah stepped out of the cabin behind her. He didn't say anything, just watched. Ashes turned to face him. For a moment, they locked eyes, man and animal. Two creatures who had carried weight, not meant to be borne alone. Noah stepped forward. Ellie offered him the rag. He took it. And together they brushed away the ash that time hadn't managed to. Ruth sat alone in her car parked in front of the mayor's office again. She stared at the building like it was a locked vault, and the truth inside had been whispering to her for too long. The letter Ellie had written was now photocopied, placed into a manila envelope addressed to the governor's public affairs office. She also enclosed a copy of the report, the one Isaac tried to bury. With it, she scribbled a note. He saved them. Then you forgot him. A 7-year-old remembered. Maybe that's the leadership we need now. She sealed the envelope and dropped it into the mailbox. Then she sat back and stared at the stars. Inside the cabin, Mabel was teaching Ellie how to fold napkins into birds. Ashes lay beside the fire, eyes half shut, one leg stretched forward like a sleeping dog. Noah sat with his back against the wall, holding a cup of tea, watching them. You think we'll have to run again? Ellie asked suddenly. No one answered at first. Then Noah spoke. Maybe, he said. But if we do, we run together. Ellie smiled. It was a small smile, but it reached her eyes. Mabel chuckled. You say that now. Wait till she starts asking questions about boys. Noah's face turned pink. Ellie grinned wider. Outside, the moon rose full and glowing over the snowy ridges of Montana. And for the first time in years, inside that small, forgotten shack, a symbol buried beneath guilt and silence began to shine again. It started with a smell, bitter, acrid, wrong. Noah was out chopping kindling when the smoke curled over the ridge. Not the soft, lazy kind from firewood, but a violent snake of black. A warning. He dropped the axe before it hit the ground. The old cabin was ablaze, not engulfed, not yet, but licked at the corners by flames that knew where to hurt. Fire danced along the porch, the curtains the brittle edge of memory. Mabel lay slumped by the doorframe, coughing hard, one arm over her eyes. Ellie was already outside barefoot in the slush, clawing at the tether rope for Ashes, who was thrashing violently, eyes rolling white. He screamed not a neigh, but a cry deep and disoriented like a soul reliving its oldest fear. Noah reached Ellie first, scooping her up with one arm, yanking Mabel by the waist with the other. Ashes reared. The fire cracked louder, a beam collapsing behind them. Someone had poured something accelerant. The stink of it still lingered. This wasn't an accident. Noah dragged them behind a thicket, threw a soaked tarp over their heads, just as embers burst across the clearing like angry stars. Morning came broken. The cabin was gone, just bones of wood and rings of ash. Ellie sat with her arms around Ashes, whose chest rose and fell with uneven rhythm. His hooves were blackened, but intact. His side was scraped, likely from slamming the fence in panic. Mabel sipped weak tea from a tin cup, her voice hoarse but steady. They wanted to silence a symbol, she rasped. Noah stood nearby, fists clenched, eyes vacant. Ellie spoke to ashes, not looking up. If they burn us again, she whispered, we'll become the ash this time. We'll rise. Ashes exhaled slow, then lowered his head into her lap. And they stayed that way, horse and girl fused in silence, surrounded by smoke. Later that afternoon, Noah walked alone to town. He didn't hitchhike. He didn't speak. He just walked through snow, through memory, until the road narrowed and the sign appeared. Redbridge Fire Station number 3. The building hadn't changed. Still brick, still proud. The flagpole leaned slightly from age. Noah stood in front of it for a long time before pushing the door open. Inside, the hum of machinery, distant laughter. A rookie tossing a football underhand between drills. Then silence as heads turned. Noah stepped forward. The station chief, bald, broad-shouldered eyes, hard from 30 years of disasters, stared at him like he'd seen a ghost. Noah, he said finally. I'm not here to make peace, Noah replied. I just want to see the wall. The chief nodded once. They walked him down a corridor with lockers on one side, plaques on the other. And there it was, a photo taken just before Larkspur. 10 men, 1 horse. Noah stood third from the left. Clean-shaven, grinning arms slung over the back of a white stallion, Ashes. The caption read, Unit 7, Montana Smoke Jumpers, 2018. Below it, 3 names had tiny crosses drawn next to them. Noah stared. They blamed me, he murmured. They blamed the fire, the chief said. And they blamed themselves. I left them. You came back. Noah blinked, his reflection flickering faintly in the frame's glass. How did we ever leave that horse behind? He asked. The chief didn't answer, because the truth had no clean exit. Back at the ruins of the cabin, Ellie found a shard of glass in the ash. It had once been part of a mirror oval, silver-rimmed. Now just a slice. She stared into it. Her face looked different, dirtied, older somehow. As if the flames had burned more than just walls. She turned to Ashes. Do you remember when you were left? The horse didn't move. Because I think you do. I think that's why you ran. Why you screamed. Ashes stepped forward slowly. His breath fogged the air between them. I don't know why people leave what they love, Ellie said. But if you stay, I'll never be one of them. Ashes bowed his head again, gently. She slid the mirror shard into her pocket. It would be her proof not of what had burned, but what remained. Ruth arrived just after dusk. The moment she saw the charred ground, her jaw tightened. She hugged Mabel, inspected Ellie's hands, then turned to Noah. This wasn't random. Noah nodded. Somebody's scared of what this story means. They should be. Ruth reached into her satchel and handed him a yellow envelope. What's this? Letter from the governor's office. Noah opened it. He read, and then he whispered, They're listening. That night, beneath a salvaged tarp and a blanket of snow, Ellie pressed herself close to Ash's side for warmth. His heart thumped beneath her cheek. I think we're not just people anymore, she said softly. I think we're stories now. Ashes flicked an ear, and the stars above, untouched by the fire, watched them both with silent approval. The cold air curled like steam around the courthouse steps. Ruth adjusted Ellie's coat collar, tugged it gently over the girl's thin neck. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from the weather. Noah didn't speak. His eyes were locked on the building in front of them. The Billings Town Hall sandstone walls streaked with winter melt windows reflecting gray Montana skies. Inside, a committee waited. So did history. Ashes stood outside the iron railing, tethered not with rope, but presence. 2 officers nearby, unsure whether they were guarding or witnessing something sacred. Ruth, Noah, and Ellie walked in, boots echoing against tile. People turned. Some whispered. A few stood. The room wasn't full, but it was alert. A few town officials, reporters, locals, survivors, skeptics. Isaac now, Mayor Isaac Ramsey, sat at the long center table, hands folded, his face unreadable. Ruth spoke first, calm but clear. We are here to request legal recognition of the horse, known as Ashes, as a living historic symbol of Montana, a non-human survivor of the Larkspur fire. Murmurs. One official asked, why now? Ellie stepped forward before Ruth could answer. Her voice was soft, but she didn't tremble. Because he never stopped remembering, she said. even when the rest of you forgot. Silence fell. She looked around, not at the officials, but at the people sitting on the wooden benches behind them. Locals, 2 old firemen, a woman holding a framed photo, a boy with soot on his boots. Ellie's words flowed like breath. You called it larkspur. You said it was too big to fight. But Ashes didn't run. He ran in. He carried people out. Then he disappeared. Until now. She held up a crumpled photograph, Ashes 6 years ago, with the firefighting unit. Noah beside him, younger hopeful before the burn scars, before the retreat. The room held its breath. They tried to take him again, she said. To lock him away. Say he doesn't belong. But maybe it's you who doesn't remember where you belong. She glanced at Isaac. He doesn't need a title. But I do. I need to know that people like him, like us, aren't just erased. Noah stood behind her now. Not to protect, to witness. Ruth stepped forward. The state has precedent. Military dogs have been honored. Service animals retired with rank. What we're asking is not radical. What's radical is that no one's done it before. Isaac leaned back in his chair. What you're asking is political. Noah replied, voice like gravel. What you're resisting is moral. Gasps, but no outcry. Isaac narrowed his eyes. You left the force, Noah. I left after watching 3 men burn because we trusted a broken chain of command, Noah said. You were at the top of that chain. Isaac's jaw tightened. Ellie tugged at Noah's sleeve. He knelt. She whispered, and he nodded. She stepped forward again. Her final words came slowly, but they hit like kindling catching. Adults tell us to be brave, but when someone really is, they hide them, or bury them, or leave them. Ashes was brave. I just want you to be the kind of grown-ups you tell kids to become. She stopped. The silence didn't shatter. It leaned, folded, broke open. A woman from the back, 60-ish, eyes swollen, stood. My son was on that unit. We thought the horse was a rumor. I didn't want to believe the rest had just vanished. But maybe now I can believe something made it out. A man followed. I fought in that fire. I saw the white blur. Thought I was dying. Turns out I was being saved. Isaac pounded the gavel. This is not public forum, he snapped. But Ruth said, maybe it should be. Outside, Ashes neighed once, long, low, clear. Reporters scribbled. An aide whispered into Isaac's ear. He looked suddenly nervous. A junior official murmured, there's precedent. New Mexico declared a donkey an honorary citizen in 2015. Laughter, but not unkind. Isaac shook his head. Even if we approve, it's not legally binding on the state registry. Ruth raised an envelope. It is, she said. We sent Ellie's letter, the footage, and your records, the ones you sealed. The governor's office replied. She opened the letter. Read aloud. In recognition of service and sacrifice rendered during the 2018 Larkspur incident, the state of Montana provisionally acknowledges Ash's rescue horse as a historic symbol of emergency response and post-disaster resilience. She folded the letter. And now it's your move. Isaac stared at her, then at Ellie, then at Noah, then lowered his eyes. I'll call for a vote. Outside as dusk fell, Ellie walked to Ashes. His ears twitched when she touched his neck. They didn't say no. He blinked. She smiled. They're not heroes yet, she whispered. But maybe they remember how to become one. She leaned into his flank forehead, resting against muscle. I don't need them to give you a name, she said. I just need them to stop taking away the ones you've earned. Behind them, Ruth and Noah stood watching. Ruth said, that was the bravest testimony I've seen in 30 years. Noah nodded. Because she didn't ask for justice. She gave it, Ruth added. Ellie turned, tugged their sleeves. Can we go home now? Noah knelt, looked into her eyes. We'll build one. On the burned area, Mabel built a small tent out of the remaining canvas. People began to stop by, some with bread, some with wool, some with a wooden sign that read, Ashes lives here. So do we. And in the cold Montana twilight, a horse stood in the wind, a child raised his head, and the adults began to learn how to be human again. The storm came like a memory that refused to stay buried. Sudden, uninvited, relentless. It didn't fall. It slammed. Rain pounded against the tarpaulin like fists on an old door that had no lock left to hold. Ellie's scream cut through the downpour. Noah. Her voice cracked hoarse from sleep and panic. Ashes, he's gone. She burst out of the shelter, barefoot flashlight beams swinging wildly into the dark. The wind screamed louder than she did. The trees, wet and blackened from the old fire, looked like ghosts reaching to pull her back. No, she cried again, stumbling down the trail, her thin legs slapping against mud, ashes. Ruth tried to grab her, but only caught air. Ellie. Noah shoved on his boots, grabbed his coat, and ran after her. The woods were a blur of water and shadows. Ellie's voice rose and fell shrill, then hoarse, then silent. She ran until her flashlight flickered, sputtered, and died. She didn't stop. She kept whispering his name. Ashes, Ashes, I'm here. Please don't go. She tripped, fell, got back up. Her palms were scraped and her knees bleeding, but she didn't notice. The storm didn't care. By morning, the storm had passed. But the world looked wounded. The earth soaked. The shelter torn. Ellie lay curled in Noah's coat under the tarp, her arms clutching a wet saddle strap like it was skin. She hadn't spoken in hours. Ruth knelt beside her, brushed the girl's matted hair. He ran, Ellie finally said, hollow. Because even he knew this place doesn't want us. Noah didn't answer. He couldn't. Then came a sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a steady thump, like something waiting. Noah rose, slowly walked to the ridge where their shelter met the clearing. He squinted through the fog, and there, standing still as stone soaked to the bone, was Ashes, outside the old firehouse. Ashes didn't move when Noah approached. The building loomed behind him like a memory set in concrete. His mane was soaked, his eyes rimmed in red, but he stood, head bowed, as if waiting for someone to remember. Noah's throat closed. You came home, he whispered. Ashes flicked one ear, but didn't blink. Noah stepped closer, hands shaking. The last time he had stood at that threshold, it was in a body bag procession. He remembered Isaac's face, the smoke, the orders, the silence after. I thought you left, he said to the horse. Thought you gave up. Ashes took a single step closer. His front hoof hit the cement. A soft tap, like knocking. Noah knelt, face soaked with more than rain. You remembered what I forgot, he said. Back at camp, Ellie saw them coming before she heard them. She ran toward Ashes, like breath returning. Ashes lowered his head. She pressed her face against his muzzle, tears soaking into his neck. I thought you left me, she sobbed. Ashes didn't move, but his breath warmed her shoulder. Noah stood back, arms folded, face unreadable. Ruth stepped beside him. He didn't run, she said. He just returned to the only place that ever made him feel like he mattered. Noah nodded slowly. And we're the ones who forgot. That night, Noah opened the old box, the one he'd kept buried in his trailer for years. Inside his badge, a photograph, a melted helmet strap, and one last thing, a brass plate. Ashes, Station 4 Companion Mount Rescue Division. Noah stared at it until dawn. Then he nailed it to the shelter post. At sunrise, Ellie wrote again, not to the governor. This time it was a letter she tucked under Ash's bridle. If you ever feel like leaving, it said, take this, so you know someone is waiting. She folded it 3 times, kissed it once, left it there. Ashes never touched it, never moved it, just stood like a monument made of scars and memory. And that morning, for the first time, villagers stopped as they passed the old road leading to the old camp. They didn't come out of curiosity. They came because the story had spread that a horse had returned to the place where the fire had burned, that a child had stood up for an adult, that a soldier who had given up was now building his faith again. A man brought coffee. A woman carried a medical kit. A child placed a scarf around Ash's neck. And no one asked, who's the boss? They just said he's back. The television screen flickered across living rooms all over Montana. It wasn't a commercial break. It wasn't a campaign. It was Isaac Ramsey, the mayor, the former fire captain, the man many remembered for what he didn't say, finally sitting under bright studio lights with a microphone clipped to his chest. He didn't look polished. He looked exhausted. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for a moment just breathed. I made a mistake, he said. His voice was low, rough, like a field after the burn. 6 years ago, I gave an order during the Larkspur fire. That order led to the deaths of 3 men. I survived. And then I stayed silent. The host didn't interrupt. Isaac looked straight into the camera. I stayed silent when they buried a rescue horse like debris. I stayed silent when that horse ashes saved men I knew, including myself. I stayed silent again when a little girl named Ellie Parker stood in front of this town and asked us to remember what courage looks like. He inhaled deeply. We left him behind, and her, and somehow they came back for us. Silence. And then the screen faded to black. The next morning, the governor's office held a press conference on the Capitol steps in Helena. The flags flew low against the winter wind. The sky was a solid gray, like it had been stitched shut. Reporters gathered. Cameramen adjusted lenses. And then the doors opened. A spokesperson stepped to the podium, clearing her throat before the world. Today, the state of Montana formally recognizes Ellie Parker and the horse known as Ashes as living symbols of post-disaster resilience and interspecies loyalty, she said. This declaration honors not just their courage, but the spirit of those forgotten in the wake of fire. There was no loud cheer, just applause, slow, deliberate rising, like something that had to be earned. Ruth stood in the crowd, holding her hands together like prayer. Noah stood behind Ellie, one hand on her shoulder, the other in his pocket, gripping something unseen. Ashes stood beside Ellie, saddleless, still quiet, a statue that breathed. Ellie didn't flinch as cameras zoomed in. Her hair was neatly combed, her jeans still frayed, her voice calm. "He didn't need you to say thank you," she said into the mic. "But I needed you to see what I saw. That he didn't run. That he stayed. That he chose to come back." The governor stepped forward and handed her a plaque. She didn't read it. She just looked at Ashes, who blinked once, slow and deliberate, like memory acknowledging memory. Later that day, the firehouse at Billings opened its doors to a new class of recruits. The smell of ash was still in the bricks, like it had never left. But something felt different. Not newer, just cleaner. Noah walked in, wearing a standard-issue jacket again. It looked out of place on him, too sharp for someone made of scars. But he wore it anyway. The room of recruits turned toward him, unsure. He didn't bark orders. He didn't pace. He didn't tell stories. He simply stood in front of the lockers, where names used to be. Then he looked up at the rafters, where the ceiling bore the faint mark of fire. A single light blinked red overhead. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled just barely. "There are things you carry," he said. "Weight, heat, guilt. And there are things that carry you. This station, it didn't save me. But something that walked on 4 legs did. And a girl who didn't flinch when she saw pain." He paused. "I came back because I wanted to know if I could still be someone worth following." No one spoke, but no one looked away. He looked at the patch on his sleeve, then out the window, where a white horse stood in the distance under a pale sun. Ashes had returned to the outskirts of town, not chained, not claimed, just present. People brought carrots. Some sat nearby without speaking. Children drew pictures of him. One child left a sign in the mud that read, "Not a pet. A promise." Ellie came by each evening. Sometimes she read aloud. Sometimes she just sat. One night she whispered, "I think you knew we'd come back. You didn't need us to. But you let us." Ashes didn't move, but the wind shifted, and Ellie looked up at the sky, no longer gray. It had opened. Blue. Bright. And in that sky, a flock of birds rose through the air like sparks returning to the clouds that once made them. 1 year later, the field had bloomed. What was once a graveyard of ash was now an ocean of golden wildflowers and tall swaying grasses. Wind moved through the meadow like a memory made gentle. The horizon shimmered under the Montana sun as if the land itself had taken a deep breath and let go. A parade moved slowly down the dirt path that split the field in two. No floats, no music. Just people, families, survivors. Some walked, some wheeled their loved ones forward. At the very front, leading the way, without fanfare, was Ellie now, 8-seated bareback on Ashes. The horse moved with quiet dignity. No reins, no saddle. Just Ellie, her palms resting lightly behind his withers, her back straight, her face calm. The crowd didn't cheer, they watched. Children held flowers. Some held drawings of ashes. Others wore ribbons on their wrists, orange and white, the colors of fire and bone. As the procession reached the new memorial stage built on the site of the old fire line, Ellie slid off Ash's back. She walked to the microphone without hesitation. In her hands, a wooden box. Standing beside her was a little girl, maybe 7, with trembling fingers and a soot-stained dress. She looked down, not up. Her name was Anna. She had lost her home to a lightning fire 3 months ago and hadn't spoken since. Ellie knelt beside her. She opened the box and held up a small bronze medal. It was shaped like a half-burned horseshoe. One edge charred, the other polished. For the first time, Ellie said softly, "You dared to hug a horse, even when you were scared. This is for that." She placed the medal in Anna's hands. Anna looked up. For the first time in weeks, her lips parted. Not to speak, just to breathe. Her arms wrapped around Ellie with the urgency of someone reaching for warmth after cold. Behind them, a banner flapped in the breeze. The Ashes Medal for Children Who Rise. The applause was quiet, but unbroken. A wave of clapping that seemed to roll across the field like wind on wheat. Ashes stood still behind them, head high, ears forward. Noah watched from the back of the crowd, hands in his pockets. His jacket bore the patch of Station 4 again. Beside him, Ruth smiled through her tears. And then the ceremony ended, but the story didn't. Ellie walked with Ashes through the field. Alone now. No speeches, no music. Just wind and wildflowers. At the crest of a small hill, she stopped. Turned. Faced the empty horizon. Ashes turned with her. She reached down, not dramatically. Just a simple human gesture. Her hand touched his hoof. He lowered it gently, and for a long, breathless moment they stayed like that. Child and horse. Fire and healing. Scar and light. There were no more words, only the sound of wind passing over a meadow that once burned and now bloomed.